In London in the year 1858, the city of London, but much wider than that, but certainly London itself, moved into a very unusual state or condition that the city was completely unaware of prior to this time. And 1858 in London was known as the summer of the Great Stink. The Great Stink. And what it was that as hundreds of thousands of people had migrated into London, many from other parts of the country, and a lot of this was due to several political factors. It was the Industrial Revolution, the Land Reform Acts, which pushed peasants off of the land that they had worked on for centuries. But also, as people were coming from other countries, London was like a magnet. And within a very short period of time, the city reached a point that it simply couldn't facilitate the level of sewage that was created every day. And what had happened, or what was happening, was that raw sewage was being fed directly from these hundreds of thousands of human beings into the River Thames. But 1858 in the summer saw the hottest day and the hottest period on record. And as a result of that, there was this intensification of the River Thames turning into this great stinking swamp of human refuse. And it was spoken about, it's still written about today, how this affected the whole of the city. And the city couldn't function normally because of this great stink. But 1858 was also important at a couple of other areas as well. It was the year that the merry hero of the literary world, Charles Dickens, chose to leave his wife, who he had lived with for 22 years and had many children with, to, if you like, go off with a young 19-year-old woman. This, at any time, would cause and would be a scandal, but as you can imagine, it was an enormous scandal at the moral level in terms of what is the compass. And as you can think of people saying, wow, what's going on? The city is just stinking. Morality is stinking. And then it was also the year that Charles Darwin published his work on what is generally, it's a much longer title, but it's generally called The Origin of the Species. And this book was, and this research, which was meticulous within the framework of what was available at that time, created an environment intellectually, but certainly within the religious world, that can only best be described as confusion. And so here you've got this confluence, or this coming together of these three powerful forces, a totally stinking environment that was almost impossible to live your life in the midst of, and then a moral compass smashed before our very eyes with this this man, this famous public figure, becoming morally compromised, and then in the intellectual and in the religious world, confusion spreads because of this work on the origin of the species. Now, I use that as an illustration of the world that we are living in today. Now, when I use the term the world we are living in today, I generally use that term to refer to what we call modern Western civilization, which is the sharing of the dominant values in all of the major metropolitan cities of the world, and certainly much of Western Europe, a lot of Eastern Europe, and also of North America. But it is a global phenomenon, this modern Western civilization. And the world that we are living in is also something like the Great Stink of 1858. And if you look at any of the statistics in any of the traditions within the church, if you like, within the big picture, you can see that there is a fundamental disillusionment with the Christian gospel. There is a mass defection taking place in all of the different traditions within Christianity, the most dramatic being the Protestant world in the United States of America, but it's also broader than that, and certainly in all of the traditions where the youth in particular are coming up with a statement saying it's just not plausible. It's not an issue of relevance, that's a different subject, but it's just not plausible. And there is this sense of moral chaos, this sense of intellectual confusion, and a spiritual condition that if we sought to diagnose it, we would say that it really is almost a sickness unto death. Now, whereas we could identify in 1858 these kinds of issues, and it's just really a metaphor, a means of using a little historical metaphor as a means of introducing this series. But if we look at this and we seek to diagnose what is going on, we have to look at history and go right back to Pentecost and see what happens when the gospel of Jesus is unleashed upon the world. Now, the world at the time of the first century can really be very simply defined as being a monotheism within Judaism and the whole world being pagan or polytheistic. So you've got very narrow parameters to work with here. But from Pentecost onwards, and I think one of the best periods to look at is the first 350 years, that what we find is that vast numbers of pagans came to Christ by rejecting something that they identified as being missing within their pagan worldview and embracing this gospel, this announcement, this kerygma of the Lord Jesus, and were coming to Christ. So there was a mass defection, a mass reaction against the pagan, and then as a result of that, people coming into the church. Now, if you look backwards from, I'm actually here in Croatia and it's 2023, if you work back from here for approximately 60 years, you can see that there is a very similar trend as the trend of pagans becoming Christians, but the trend, the process has reversed. And as a result of that, what we can see now is vast numbers of people who come from Christian backgrounds, particularly second-generation Christians. That is, their parents were Christian and probably come from some ancestry of Christianity. But at this time, this generation is rejecting Christianity and turning to, I wouldn't simply use the word pagan because that evokes too many easy stereotypes, but what I call non-Christian creative spiritualities. And so there has been this reversal of processes. Huge numbers of pagans coming to Christ as they reject their pagan worldview and receive Christ, whereas now vast numbers of people becoming neo-pagans or experimenting with or entering into or desiring to enter into non-Christian creative spiritualities in rejection of their Christianity. Now, this is a very serious issue because the trends appear to show us that this process isn't going to either suddenly end or even slow down. The indication is it is going to accelerate. Now, wherever you are in the world listening to this, you will know people who previously would have been perhaps nominal Christian, or if you like, even secular, who are now participating in some kind of new age spirituality, whether it's crystals or whether it's tarot cards or whether it's some kind of Wicca or goddess worship, whatever it is. You know people who have entered into this, and this number is going to increase. So when we look at this, we have to ask ourselves some very, very tough questions, because what is happening is that there is a plausibility gap between the unbelieving world that is leaning towards non-Christian creative spiritualities and what the church, particularly in its institutional form, has become. Now, that's in a sense, we can unpack this, and we will unpack this during the series, but it's a very, very key issue. And it's like we no longer, the plausibility gap is such that we no longer speak the same language. Yes, linguistically, but at the deeper level, we don't really communicate. Going back to London, but not 1858, but some years ago, I was coming I was in the city, and there's several different stations on the underground or the tube or the metro in London where there's a gap between the platform and the edge of the train that you're getting off of. And it used to be, when I was very young, that there'd be somebody there shouting out, "Mind the gap, mind the gap." Now, of course, it's just a recording. And so as you pull into the station and the doors come open, immediately you are greeted with the sound of, coming over the loudspeakers, "Mind the gap, mind the gap." And of course, you look down, you see the gap, you mind the gap and jump over it. Well, this day I saw that Mind the Gap, and I was coming out and walking up the stairs, and there was a man there. He was a beggar. He was an alcoholic, and he came up. He was obviously disturbed, but he came up to me, and he started to speak, but he was speaking in gibberish, something like, it was just nothing I could get a hold of. And I said to him, "I'm sorry, mate, I can't understand what you're saying. What are you trying to say?" So what he did was he started shouting in his gibberish even louder. And it got to the point where I said, whoa, calm down. I can't get what you're saying. What is it you're trying to say? He was probably trying to say, "Can you give me some money because I'm hungry, or I need a beer," or whatever it was. But the more we were unable to communicate, the louder he shouted. And in my mind, I'm thinking, mind the gap, mind the gap. That illustration is a picture of what we are looking at today. And that is our kerygma, our announcement concerning the Lord Jesus. And there's lots of variations to this, and I'm not going to go into that right now. It's very clear in our minds what it is, but it isn't clear in the minds of the young people who are turning away from Christianity to become neo-pagans or to become a part of the non-Christian creative spirituality world. It's clear to us, and we want them to stop. We want them to listen to what we have to say, but it seems like they just don't get it. And so what we tend to do is raise our voice and begin to shout. And I didn't shake that man, although I probably felt like it at the time. But it's like we want to shake them. But in reality, there is this huge gap that exists between what we think of as our Christian world and the world, the modern world of today that we live in. And so this series, which is quite in depth, it has a lot of practicalities, but it has a lot of theoretical aspects to it, is designed to explore and study the origins of the problem, looking at the core truths that had the impact upon the pagan world at that time, and look at how that is in conflict with the world that we live in today, and then coming up with a way of learning a language, a way of minding the gap by not shouting louder and louder, impatient because they just don't get it, but really understand the world that we are seeking to communicate within. There's in the dialogues of Plato, you get the three that work very closely together, almost handmaidens to each other, and that is the Symposium, the Republic, and then Phaedrus. And in the dialogue, Socratic dialogue of Phaedrus, we see this chariot, and this chariot has, some have said it was Zeus, the omnipotent pagan deity of that time, who is trying to drive and ride this chariot. And there are two horses. One horse is reasonable, is reason-orientated, and is rational in the way that it thinks and it operates. The other horse is irrational, supra-emotional, and totally spontaneous. And so the chariot, which is being led up into the heavens of the gods, is going through this navigational nightmare as these horses are pulling into different directions. And then, of course, in this dialogue, the discussion is about bringing harmony in the midst of these two antithetical forces of the irrational and the rational, of the hyper-emotional and of the reason-based. This conflict between the rational, the reason, and the irrational and the emotion, that conflict and the lack of harmony and the lack of balance that is created as a result of this lays at the core of this whole study series. And you could really say that this also lays at the foot, and it outlines the intrinsic spiritual battle for balance that women and men live within even today. But it is going to be a study which I would say you need to put your seatbelt on, because it is really going to be a bumpy ride, because it's going to stretch you, us, as we study together, into areas that are going to create discomfort. There's no question of that. But at the same time, I would propose to you that this course really should be able to help you understand these powerful spiritual forces that are currently at work, and how much of the destruction that is going on within the world that we think of as the Christian world is related to this great conflict. So I do hope you'll take time to study with us. Each of the sections, there are 8 sections that we will look at together, and each of those has a very short, like this one, a very short video introduction. So please just take a few minutes just to look at those and listen to that. And if this is something that you sense that you would like to pursue, then just send us a note in the contact form on this page, and we will share with you about the different dates for the streaming and all that's involved in this. So mind the gap, people, mind the gap.